Hello and welcome to the PhD Life Raft podcast. I'm Emma Brzezinski, and this episode I am talking to the awesome Yulia Karpova. Yulia has just started her second PhD. Yes, you heard that right. And in this episode, we talk about the journey that's taken her to this point and also how she's approaching things second time around. So I do hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, Yulia.
Hi.
So lovely to have you here. I cannot wait for this conversation. I was telling someone I was going to be interviewing someone who was doing their second PhD and her jaw just dropped. I was like, yes, second PhD. Yes, indeed. This is what we're talking about today. But before we get into that, I'm going to ask, as I ask everyone, for you to tell us a bit about your story into your first PhD, indeed, and then what's brought you to this place now.
Okay, thank you very much, Emma, for having me here. And indeed, I'm probably the first guest at your podcast who is doing a second PhD.
Yes.
Some of your listeners will wonder if it is even allowed. And immediately I run ahead and say, in fact, sometimes and in some places it is. And in some situations, it's actually pretty common, but I'll come to this later.
Yes.
So about my journey, in fact, I would like to start with a shout out to my mother, who did her PhD, who defended her PhD when I was 12 years old, and she was writing it as a part-time PhD student. So we lived in a provincial town in Russia, and again, presenting myself publicly as someone originating from Russia is tricky, involves tricky feelings these days, but this is part of me, this is part of my story. And my mother really had it difficult. She completed this work in the context of poverty, in the context of very patriarchal, sexist atmosphere at her department, and she convinced her very skeptical and very harsh supervisor, who did not even take her topic seriously somehow, that it's worth pursuing. And she defended with great appreciation from the committee. And while I was looking at how she was struggling, I decided as a teenager, no, I'm not going to do it. But here I am.
What's your mum's name?
Tatiana.
Tatiana, this one today is for you. She sounds amazing. Sounds amazing, right?
She's my rock. She's my mother is my support. She supports my decisions, and she supported my decision to study art history when I was a high school student, and had many challenges, had certain health issues, which made it more difficult for me to complete the high school with excellent grades, which I did nonetheless. I decided to go into the career path that would not guarantee me stable income and any financial stability, any definite prospects in life. But I was passionate about art history, and my mother was on the same page. She supported me in that. So I did undergrad studies in Russia in art history. And by the time I was finishing, I could say this equals roughly master degree.
Right.
And then my mother moved by personal reasons to Hungary, to Budapest. And I didn't plan to do this as well, but then I learned about a graduate university, a university where the program started at MA level. Central European University. Some of your listeners may have heard of it, or maybe even visited a stayed as a visiting scholar there, or even completed a degree there. So the university was founded so to say, at the ruins of state socialism, with the idea of building, of preparing the new political elites for the so-called post-socialist region, for the countries which emerged after 1989, but also intellectual elites and critical thinkers. So quite ambitious goal. The reality was more complicated sometimes. There was some diversity between departments, but I'm very much indebted to my alma mater. So I moved there to complete an MA, 1-year MA program in history, because there was no art history department. And then I stayed for a PhD. So I applied for a PhD, and this university is accredited in the US. So the program is very much US like, but a little bit, I would say, simplified in some areas. For example, the comprehensive exam, which people pass after the first year of PhD program, is, I think, based on what I heard, it's simpler. So I didn't want to go back to Russia because my housing situation was quite challenging. I couldn't imagine finding a good job there. So instead, I decided to embark on a PhD journey, and I had a wonderful supporting supervisor, an American scholar who who has been living in Budapest for, I guess, approximately 30 years. Amazing person, Professor Maria Ziefert. I am forever indebted. I really owe her so much of where I am and what I can do now. So it took me 6 years, which is pretty standard in American measurements of the PhD. And I defended in 2015. So I'm blessed to have defended my dissertation in the still few years pre-COVID. And also, that's quite interesting. Now I know that viva is a term in the UK context for the defense. In the American context, I guess that's dissertation defense. In Denmark, we say PhD forsvar, so the same, the defense. So it was a very good experience. The PhD journey was challenging in many respects. Several times I imagined that my dissertation will be rejected. No, first, that I would never complete it. Even if I do, some of the committee would not allow it to be proceeded to the defense. But all my colleagues knew already. When they heard me saying something like that, they said, "Okay, Yulia, we know, just go ahead and write." And so the defense was a very pleasant experience.
Lovely.
So friends came. My mother doesn't speak English, but my stepfather was there, and my mother was waiting when the result is announced, and my friends were there. It was amazing. And after that, followed the period of unemployment for a few months, and then a year of trying to make ends meet. So I did several part-time university-related works as, for example, assistant archivist in an archive, which is a part of the university, or as research assistants, as part-time lecturers. So I managed. I was happy that I could still stay in academia. I didn't have to quit after this very pleasant defense with summa cum laude and with hearing the words of appreciation and support. And after that, I, by a very kind advice of my supervisor, Professor Ziefert, I applied for a Marie Curie scholarship to spend 2 years in Aarhus, in Denmark, in the region of Jutland. And I succeeded. So I turned 30 in the summer of 2016. And that thus started the second chapter, the new chapter of my life, or the new chapter of my academic life. And I moved to Denmark, and that was quite a cultural shock because at Central European University, or CEU, it was very international atmosphere. There was no national majority. There were, of course, Hungarian faculty and students, but they were not the majority. Everyone spoke English with some accent, just like like myself. Of course, there were American students as well, usually American students with some heritage, some ancestry in East Central Europe.
Nice.
Well, in Denmark, I happened to be at the Department of Communication and Culture, and there the majority of postdocs and professors were Danish. And it took me some time to get used to that, but it was also a welcoming atmosphere, even though I was a bit lonely because I was working on my book. It was not a dissertation book, it was 30% from the dissertation and a lot of additional research. So this is how I prepared my first monograph, and then I still needed to finish it up after this postdoc when I returned back to Hungary. And in 2020, just before the pandemic, the book was published. The book is about Soviet design, and it looks at the different ideas and projects related to what is an ideal socialist object. And I looked at the late socialist period, so from the 60s to the mid-80s, before the important reforms under Gorbachev, known as perestroika. I didn't go forward into that period because it's quite special and deserves a monograph on its own. Anyway, the book was quite well received and got some nice reviews. And at the same time, I was passionate about going back to Denmark. And thanks to the networks that I established during my first postdoc, I got a second postdoc already as a part of a project with an art historian, with my colleague Christian Hanber, an art historian. We researched the Cold War cultural diplomacy and specifically how Danes presented their art and design at exhibitions in the socialist bloc. Also, our chronological framework was similar to my books, so this from the 50s, 60s to the 80s. And then the postdoc ended in the summer of 2022. And the last month of the postdoc was, of course, the time which I would say that it really shaped my life, but that would be not very nice to say because it's not me who was, of course, shaken by that. I mean, the war in Ukraine. And it was, when my Danish colleagues tried to support me, I was sitting in my office at the University of Copenhagen. This is where my second postdoc was. I would tell them it's very nice, but it's not me who needs support. It's Ukrainian scholars, and especially those who are displaced persons, and they had of course, I'm not only speaking about the academics who need support, but in this context, I was thinking about the people who had their careers interrupted in this absolutely dramatic way. Yes. And the field of East European and Slavic and Soviet studies, of course, is undergoing very important conceptual changes. And at the same time, just to get back to the track, I needed to make important decisions, what I would like to do. And I followed up on one of the research interests, which I developed a few years ago, namely medical design specifically in the area of women's health. And it so happened that I did not manage to secure any further academic position in Denmark, and I had a postdoc offer from Sweden. So I could go for my third postdoc to Sweden. But by a number of personal and professional reasons, I would very much preferred rather to stay in Denmark. So I had this dilemma: Denmark versus academia. Either stay in Denmark and quit and try to find a job beyond academia, and that would be challenging because I'm not fluent in Danish. and I have almost zero experience beyond academia, or I try to solve this dilemma in some other way. And so the second PhD very kindly offered to me by the University of Southern Denmark, the Department of Design and Communication. That was my solution of the dilemma. Of course, I applied and I asked them, basically, I wanted to join a fantastic project about design and body, design as somatic expertise, launched by a professor of the department. And I contacted him and said, I see you have this wonderful project and you are looking for a PhD student who would write about body and design in the context of medicine. And it sounds like what I want to do. This is my passion. I really want to do this research. I want to have this opportunity. That would be fantastic. But there is a little problem. I already have a PhD from 2015 and I did 2 postdocs. So may I even apply? And he replied, you may, in fact, because your PhD is in history and this is design studies. It's a different discipline. But don't expect much because you're overqualified. So this is the word I heard so much before. I said, of course, I know my place. But well, I ended up joining the department, and strange, however it is, I decided for myself. It was a difficult choice, couple of sleepless nights, a lot of discussion with colleagues. But I thought to myself, oh, it's not a step backward, it's a step to the side, not even a step aside, but it is a step otherwise, still within my career. And I also talked about it. I sometimes meet up and have a coffee with Professor Zippert, my PhD supervisor from Budapest. And of course, she always wants to know how I am doing. And I had to confess, and I was so frightened. Imagine telling your PhD supervisor you're embarking on another PhD. And she was so supportive. She told me, you know what? She told me, I know many colleagues from Germany, and what they have is habilitation. So this is another degree after the PhD. So think of it as your habilitation.
She sounds awesome. We love her. So you are doing then your second PhD. So this podcast generally is all about how to get through the PhD. We've already done that once. So I'm just wondering if you could share with us then when you're coming into it for the second time, what did you learn from that first time round, which you are now applying, and how is it different this second time round?
Yes, it is different in quite a number of ways. Well, during my first PhD, which was, as I mentioned, quite long, I learned a great deal. I learned to organize myself, to prioritize, all these things that people doing the PhD learn. I learned to communicate my findings and my doubts and reconsider my ideas, to rewrite many times. I learned international networking. I learned finding out where to apply, to which conferences I would rather invest in what conference trips I should invest my time. So that was a great deal of learning. And I also learned already, after the defense, looking back at that experience, I felt that it's so important to be kind to yourself. It sounds extremely banal, and
no, it does not.
Everyone says that, but this is true because I was so harsh on myself. I would be hiding in the bathroom crying. I would be leaving the PhD office. I would cry because I hated what I just written. So much, because I couldn't take a distance. I was so tired. I just lost the touch of the objective reality of my writing, which was gradually improving. And by the time I was writing up, it was decent for that stage. But I need also to say that in my first PhD, I started it, I was 23. So I, at the risk of sounding infantilizing, I can say I was a baby PhD. I wouldn't say it about someone else who starts PhD at a very young age, but I was a baby PhD. And I was growing up. I think I was really becoming a proper adult as I was moving forward in my PhD. Now it is, of course, it is different. Now I allow myself, considering myself a responsible adult, a proper adult. Now I'm 36. And also some of the fellow PhD students in the department are considerably older. They are closer to the age to my first PhD supervisor. Because as I also learned from your podcast, from many interviews, some people have different arrangement of tasks and engagements in life. Some of these PhD students, they had a long career, and at some point they decided that now I want to learn something, I want to accomplish this academic task. So it really helped me, because I felt, okay, now so many people in mid-30s, mid to late 30s have real adult careers, and I'm going back to the PhD, but thinking of the PhD not as a age-related or certain age stage related experience, but as a journey that you can decide to choose at any point of your life. This is very helpful.
Oh, I love it. That's going on. That's becoming my new strapline. It's a journey you can take at any age. And I love that sense of, as you say, there will be people who are much older and people much younger, and coming at it in a phase of your life that is right for you. And I love that you're looking back and going, okay, so I was quite a different person then in that first PhD. And I also love that you're talking about the skills, because it kind of, it's what we talk about a lot on the podcast, the skills that are beyond the discipline specific skills. So all those skills that you talked about in terms of the way in which you're organizing your time, the project management, managing yourself and your emotions, because it's an emotional journey. All of that learning then, it's absolutely applicable, even though you're now in a different department doing a different subject. Love it. So I am aware of time, and we always ask. There's so much more. There's a few more podcast episodes, I feel, in terms of your story. As you said, in terms of being an international student, all that means. But I'm going to ask my really reductive question now, in terms of, do you have any top tips from the perspective of someone who has done it already and is now doing it for the second time, to share with people?
Okay, the top tip. There are many top tips that one can give, and I heard many brilliant ones in your podcast episodes. The top tip I would give to someone who is considering applying for a PhD is to learn what are the specific requirements, a specific structure, because now I direct this tip to an international student, and especially to those who have the type of a PhD which is called aspirantura, which is very typical in many countries, how to say it better, that used to belong to the Soviet Union. And some of these academics, they actually aspire to have a Western PhD, or the kind of the PhD of what we think about when we say PhD. So for them, I would really recommend learning about the differences of different PhDs, because I had an American PhD in Hungary, and now I'm doing a Danish PhD in Denmark, and they are quite different in many respects, and both are quite different from the British PhD. So this is very important to orient yourself what format suits better your time frame, your expectations, and your goals. And for those who are at the PhD, no matter if it's your second or your first, like, Western PhD, or if it's your the only PhD, I think networking is so important. And as so many of your guests said, reaching for help, for support, for peer feedback, and also learning early on what kind of services are there at your university. Also, depending on the country you are in, what resources are there for support. So it's okay to ask for help. It's not a sign of weakness. I had this even at the beginning of this journey. I thought, I have been there. I must be so smart. I should know how to do it. I should have no issues at all. But I did have questions and I did have issues, and I asked for support. So this is very, very crucial, I think.
Love it. And you have spoken so fondly in this interview about your colleagues and your supervisors, and this real sense of those kind of meaningful connections that you have made through this journey. Yulia, thank you so much for all of that. And I wish you all the very, very best. Do you get called double doctor or something like that at the end of it?
Double doctor sounds nice. Thank you very much. It was such a pleasure to speak with you today.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for listening.